The blood on Martha Hannigan's palms looked almost black in the fading light as she dragged herself across the dusty floor of her cabin, desperate to reach the door before her husband returned. The year was 1878, and life in Sierra City, California, had become a living nightmare for the 24-year-old woman who had once dreamed of a home filled with children's laughter. As she pulled herself up by the door handle, wincing at the pain shooting through her ribs, Martha knew she had to escape before Thomas returned from the saloon, drunk and ready to punish her yet again for what he called her worthless barren womb. Martha had been married for 6 years, and with each passing year without a child, Thomas's disappointment had festered into rage. Tonight's beating had been the worst, yet she'd made the mistake of suggesting they might speak to the doctor in Sacramento about why they couldn't conceive. Thomas had flown into a fury, accusing her of trying to blame him, of being defective as a woman. "What good is a wife who can't give me sons?" he had roared before his fists began to fall. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the purple sky as Martha limped along the edge of town, keeping to the shadows. Sierra City had grown considerably since the gold rush days, nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains with its sawmills and stamp mills bringing steady work, but it was still small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. No one knew what happened behind the closed doors of the Hannigan cabin. Martha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, hiding the bruises on her neck. She had no destination in mind, only away. Away from Thomas, away from the whispers of the town women who looked at her with pity when she passed, away from the life that had become nothing but pain and disappointment. She had almost reached the edge of town when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Panicking, Martha ducked behind a water trough, praying it wasn't Thomas coming to drag her home. "Whoa there, Diablo," a deep voice commanded, and the horse's hooves skidded to a stop just yards from Martha's hiding place. Martha held her breath as boots hit the dirt. Then a shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the night sky. "Madam," the voice was gentle, concerned. "Are you all right?" Martha tried to scramble away, but pain shot through her side, forcing a gasp from her lips. The man crouched down, and in the dim light from a nearby window, she could make out his features: a weathered face, perhaps 30 years old, with kind eyes and a worried frown beneath the brim of a dusty hat. "You're hurt," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "Let me help you." "No," Martha whispered, "please. My husband, is he the one who did this to you?" The man's voice hardened, and Martha saw his hand move to the revolver at his hip. When she didn't answer, he seemed to understand. "My name's Matthew Tucker. I've got a place about 3 miles out of town." "You'll be safe there until we figure out what to do." Martha shook her head. "You don't understand. He'll find me. He always does." Matthew Tucker's expression darkened. "Not this time, madam. Not if I have anything to say about it." He offered his hand. "Can you stand?" With his help, Martha got to her feet, though she swayed dangerously. Without hesitation, Matthew lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, one strong arm keeping her steady against his chest. "What's your name?" he asked as they rode out of town, the sound of the hooves muffled by the soft dirt of the road. "Martha," she whispered. "Martha Hannigan." "Well, Martha Hannigan," he said, his voice a rumble she could feel against her back. "I promise you're safe now." Martha wanted to believe him, but she'd heard promises before. Thomas had promised to love and cherish her, promised her a life of happiness. Still, as they rode through the darkness toward Matthew Tucker's ranch, something inside her, something she thought had died long ago, flickered to life. It wasn't hope, not yet. But perhaps it was the beginning of hope. The Tucker Ranch came into view just as the moon rose above the mountains, a sturdy cabin with a wide porch, a barn, and corrals outlined in silver moonlight. A dog's bark greeted them, followed by the appearance of a young man hurrying from the barn. "Mr. Tucker, didn't expect you back so soon." The young man stopped short when he saw Martha. "What's happened?" "Nate, this is Mrs. Hannigan," Matthew said as he dismounted and gently helped Martha down. "She's going to be staying with us for a while. Can you see to Diablo while I get her inside?" Nate, who couldn't have been more than 19, nodded without asking questions, taking the horse's reins as Matthew guided Martha to the cabin. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and a few pieces of sturdy furniture. Matthew lit a lamp, and in the warm glow, Martha could see the concern on his face as he took in her injuries. "You need a doctor," he said. "No," Martha said quickly. "No doctor, please." Matthew hesitated, then nodded. "All right, for now. But if you're worse in the morning, I'm fetching Doc Wilson whether you like it or not." He gestured to a door off the main room. "That's my room. You can sleep there. I'll take the bunk in the back room." "I can't take your bed. You can and you will," Matthew said firmly. "There's water in the pitcher by the washstand, clean towels in the chest. Help yourself to anything you need." Martha stood awkwardly, not knowing what to say. "Thank you," she finally managed. "But you don't know me. Why are you doing this?" Matthew's expression was unreadable for a moment. Then he said, "Let's just say I've seen what men like your husband can do, and I've sworn never to stand by and let it happen if I can help it." He paused. "Are you hungry?" Martha realized she was starving. She hadn't eaten since breakfast before Thomas had started drinking. She nodded. "I'll heat up some stew. You get washed up." In the privacy of Matthew's room, Martha examined her injuries in a small mirror hanging on the wall. Her right eye was swollen, a purple bruise spreading across her cheekbone. Her lip was split, and when she carefully lifted her dress, she saw more bruises blooming across her ribs. She washed as best she could, wincing at every movement, then found a clean shirt of Matthew's to sleep in, her own dress being torn and blood-stained. When she emerged, Matthew had a bowl of stew waiting for her at the table, along with a chunk of bread and a cup of coffee. Nate had come in from the barn and was sitting at the table as well, trying not to stare at her bruises. "Mrs. Hannigan, this is Nate Holloway," Matthew said. "He works for me." "Madam," Nate said, nodding politely. "Please call me Martha," she said, self-consciously touching her bruised face. They ate in silence for a while until Nate excused himself to sleep in the bunkhouse, leaving Martha alone with Matthew. "Your husband," Matthew said once Nate had gone. "He done this before." Martha stared into her coffee cup. "Yes, because you don't have children," Matthew guessed. Martha looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "Overheard him at the saloon once, complaining about his useless wife. Wanted to break his jaw then and there." Matthew's voice was calm, but Martha saw the anger in his eyes. "No man has the right to treat a woman that way, especially not his wife." "He wasn't always like this," Martha said softly. "When we first married, he was kind. But as the years passed with no children." She trailed off, the familiar shame washing over her. Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My sister couldn't have children. Her husband loved her anyway, all their days together. That's how it should be." Martha felt tears threatening and quickly blinked them away. "Thomas says I'm worthless as a woman if I can't give him sons." "Thomas Hannigan is a fool," Matthew said flatly, "and a cruel one at that." They were silent for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. "What will you do now?" Matthew finally asked. Martha had been asking herself the same question. "I don't know. I have nowhere to go, no family, no money of my own." "You can stay here as long as you need," Matthew offered. "I've got plenty of room, and Nate could use some help with the cooking and such if you're willing." Martha looked at him skeptically. "And what would your wife say about that arrangement?" "No wife," Matthew replied with a small smile. "Just me and Nate and about 100 head of cattle." Martha nodded slowly. "I appreciate the offer, truly, but Thomas will look for me. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Matthew's expression hardened. "Let him come. I'm not afraid of Thomas Hannigan." Martha wanted to tell him he should be afraid Thomas was dangerous when he was angry, but she was too exhausted to argue. Tomorrow she would figure out what to do. For tonight, she would accept the safety this kind stranger offered. "Thank you," she said again, "for everything." Matthew nodded. "Get some rest, Martha. Things will look better in the morning." As Martha settled into Matthew's bed, surrounded by the unfamiliar scent of him leather and pine, and something uniquely male, she wondered if anything would ever look better again. For 6 years, she had endured Thomas's growing resentment and eventual violence, believing somehow it was her fault, that she deserved it for failing to give him children. Now, lying in a stranger's bed, her body aching from her husband's fists, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: anger. Not at herself, but at Thomas. And with that anger came a dangerous, exhilarating thought. What if she didn't go back? What if she never went back? With that rebellious thought echoing in her mind, Martha drifted into an exhausted sleep. Martha woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, she was disoriented, then the events of the previous night came flooding back, along with the pain in her body. She rose gingerly, finding that someone had laid out a clean dress on a chair, plain but well made, though a bit large for her frame. She dressed carefully, doing her best to ignore the shooting pains in her ribs, then stepped out into the main room. Matthew was at the stove, frying bacon. He turned when he heard her, his eyes taking in her appearance. "That was my sister's dress," he said. "Thought it might fit you better than one of my shirts." "Your sister's?" Martha asked, her hand smoothing over the fabric. "She and her husband lived here with me until about a year ago. They moved to Oregon, wanted to start fresh after." He trailed off. "After they lost their third baby." "I'm sorry," Martha said softly. Matthew shrugged. "She's happy now. Got a little girl they adopted 6 months back." He gestured to the table. "Sit, you need to eat." Martha sat, and Matthew placed a plate of bacon, eggs, and biscuits in front of her, along with a steaming cup of coffee. "Where's Nate?" she asked, looking around. "Already out working, boys up with the sun every day." Matthew sat across from her with his own plate. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Sore," Martha admitted, "but I'll be all right." Matthew studied her for a moment. "You still set on leaving?" Martha hesitated. The thought of facing Thomas again made her stomach clench with fear, but what choice did she have? "I don't know where else to go." "You could stay here," Matthew said again. "Help around the place. I meant what I said last night." "And what would people think? A woman living here with 2 unmarried men?" Matthew smiled slightly. "People in Sierra City know me well enough. Besides, my nearest neighbor is 5 miles away." "Not much chance of gossip out here." Martha picked at her food, considering. "Thomas will come looking." "Let him," Matthew said, that same hardness entering his voice. "I've dealt with men like Thomas Hannigan before." Something in his tone made Martha look up sharply. "Who are you, Mr. Tucker?" "Just a rancher," he said, but there was something in his eyes that told Martha there was more to the story. "No," she said slowly. "There's more to it than that." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, then he sighed. "I was a lawman for a while. Marshal in a town up north. Saw my share of men who thought their wives were property to do with as they pleased." "A marshal," Martha repeated. That explained the air of quiet authority he carried. "Not anymore," Matthew said. "Just a rancher now, but I still know how to handle a man like Thomas." Martha considered this. The idea of staying, of not having to face Thomas again, was tempting, but she'd learned the hard way not to trust in easy solutions. "I'll stay for a few days," she decided. "Until these bruises fade enough that I won't draw stares, then I'll move on." Matthew didn't look pleased with this plan, but he nodded. "Fair enough. In the meantime, you rest." "I'm not one to sit idle," Martha protested. "I can work, cook, clean, mend, whatever needs doing." "There's no rush, please," Martha interrupted. "I need to be useful." Matthew studied her face, then nodded in understanding. "All right. There's mending in that basket by the fireplace if you're so inclined, and I wouldn't say no to a proper meal tonight. Nate and I get by, but neither of us has much talent in the kitchen." Martha felt a small smile tug at her lips, the first in longer than she could remember. "I think I can manage that." After breakfast, Matthew headed out to join Nate with the cattle, leaving Martha alone in the cabin. For the first time in years, she found herself in a space where she didn't have to be constantly alert, constantly fearful. The silence was strange after being so long on edge. She spent the morning cleaning the cabin, which wasn't particularly dirty but could use a woman's touch. Then she tackled the basket of mending shirts with missing buttons, socks with holes, a pair of trousers with a torn knee. The simple, familiar work was soothing. At midday, she heard hoofbeats and tensed, but it was only Nate returning for supplies. He blushed when he saw her, still awkward around this unexpected woman in their midst. "Mr. Tucker sent me to check on you, madam," he said, standing just inside the door as if afraid to come further, "and to fetch some rope from the barn." "I'm fine, Nate," Martha assured him. "And please, it's Martha," Nate nodded, still looking uncomfortable. "Yes, madam, I mean Martha. Are you hungry? I could make you something to eat before you head back out." The boy brightened at that. "That'd be mighty kind of you." Martha quickly prepared a simple meal of leftover biscuits, bacon, and some beans she'd found in the pantry. Nate ate with the enthusiasm of a growing boy, and as his hunger was satisfied, he seemed to relax around her. "How long have you worked for Mr. Tucker?" Martha asked as she poured him more coffee. "Going on 2 years now," Nate said. "He took me on when no one else would. I was just a skinny kid who'd never worked a day on a ranch, but he gave me a chance anyway." "He seems like a good man," Martha said carefully. "The best," Nate agreed without hesitation. "Fair, honest, treats his men and his animals right." He paused, then added more quietly, "He saved my life, truth be told." Martha's curiosity was piqued. "How so?" Nate looked down at his plate. "I was in some trouble in Nevada. Bad crowd making worse choices. Mr. Tucker was passing through, stepped in when some fellows were fixing to beat me half to death over a card game, paid my debt, and offered me a job instead of a lecture." He looked up, his young face earnest. "He does that, you know, helps folks who need it." Like me, Martha thought but didn't say. After Nate left, Martha explored the pantry more thoroughly and planned a proper dinner. When she found a sourdough starter tucked away in a cool corner, she decided to bake bread, as well, something she'd always enjoyed doing in the early days of her marriage, before Thomas's resentment had poisoned everything. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, a simple tune her mother used to sing. It had been so long since she'd felt safe enough to hum. The afternoon passed quickly, and soon she heard the men returning. She smoothed her hair and straightened her borrowed dress, suddenly nervous. It had been a long time since she'd cooked for anyone but Thomas, and even longer since she'd wanted to impress someone with her cooking. The door opened, and Matthew entered, bringing with him the smell of fresh air and horses. He stopped short when he saw the table set with his best dishes, which she'd found tucked away in a cupboard, a loaf of fresh bread, and a pot of stew bubbling on the stove. "Something smells mighty good," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I hope you like venison stew," Martha said. "I found some meat in your cold storage." "That was from the deer Nate got last week," Matthew said, moving closer to inspect the stew. "We've been eating it roasted, but stew sounds like a fine change." Nate came in a few minutes later, and the three of them sat down to eat. The men's appreciation for her cooking was obvious and genuine, and Martha felt a warm glow of satisfaction. Such a simple thing, a meal shared with people who showed basic kindness, and yet it felt like a luxury after years of eating across from Thomas's scowling face. "This bread," Matthew said, taking another slice, "might be the best I've ever had." "It's just sourdough," Martha said, though she was pleased by the compliment. "Just sourdough," she says, Matthew said to Nate with a grin. "Like it's nothing to create something this good out of flour and water." Nate nodded in agreement, his mouth too full of bread and stew to speak. After dinner, Nate excused himself to the bunkhouse, leaving Martha and Matthew alone again. Matthew poured them each a small glass of whiskey, and they sat by the fire, the evening having turned cool with the mountain air. "Thank you for dinner," Matthew said. "It's been a long time since this place felt like a home." Martha sipped her whiskey, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "It's a lovely home. You've built something good here." "Trying to," Matthew agreed, "still a work in progress." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "Tell me about yourself, Martha," Matthew finally said. "How did you end up married to a man like Thomas Hannigan?" Martha sighed, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "I was 18, naive. Thomas was charming, handsome, full of big dreams. My parents had died the year before influenza, and I was living with an aunt who made it clear I was a burden. When Thomas proposed after just 3 months of courting, it seemed like the answer to my prayers." "And when did things change?" Matthew asked gently. "Gradually, then suddenly," Martha said. "The first year was good, he was kind, attentive, but when I didn't get with child right away, he grew frustrated. By the 3rd year, he was drinking heavily, staying out late. The first time he hit me was after I'd miscarried our only pregnancy." She took another sip of whiskey. "He apologized afterwards, swore it would never happen again, but it did, again and again." "Why didn't you leave?" Matthew asked, though his tone held no judgment. Martha gave a bitter laugh. "And go where? Do what?" A woman alone has few options, Mr. Tucker, and Thomas made sure I understood what would happen if I tried to leave him. Matthew's face darkened. He threatened you. He said he'd find me no matter where I went, Martha confirmed. That he'd drag me back and make me wish I'd never been born. She shuddered at the memory. I believed him, I still do. He won't touch you again, Matthew said, his voice hard with certainty. I give you my word. Martha studied his face in the firelight, the strong jaw, the determined set of his mouth, the kindness in his eyes despite the hardness of his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that there could be men so different from Thomas. Why do you care what happens to me? She asked softly. I'm nothing to you. Matthew was quiet for so long that Martha thought he might not answer. Then he said, My mother was married to a man like Thomas. He beat her regularly, especially when he was drinking. One night when I was 12, he beat her so badly she couldn't get out of bed for days. My sister and I tried to stop him, but we were just children. His voice was controlled, but Martha could hear the old pain beneath the words. What happened? She asked. She died, Matthew said simply. Not from that beating, but from the next one 3 months later. He claimed she fell down the stairs. Everyone knew the truth, but no one did anything. Not the sheriff, not the neighbors, not the preacher who'd seen her bruises every Sunday. I'm so sorry, Martha whispered. Matthew met her eyes. I swore then that I'd never stand by and watch a woman suffer if I could help it. So you see, Martha, it's not about you being nothing to me. It's about you being someone who deserves better than what life has handed you so far. Martha felt tears prick her eyes and blinked rapidly to clear them. Thank you, she said, not knowing what else to say in the face of such unexpected kindness. They talked a while longer, Matthew telling her about his ranch, his plans to expand, his dreams of breeding horses as well as cattle. Martha found herself relaxing in his company, the fear that had been her constant companion for years receding just a little. When she finally went to bed in what she still thought of as Matthew's room, though he insisted it was hers for now, she slept more soundly than she had in years, without the dread of what the morning might bring. The next few days fell into a pleasant routine. Martha would cook breakfast for the men, then spend her days cleaning, mending, baking, and preparing dinner. Sometimes she would walk around the property, enjoying the freedom to go where she pleased without fear. The fresh air and mountain views began to heal something inside her that had been broken for a long time. Her bruises were fading, but she found herself inventing reasons to stay just a little longer. Matthew never pressed her about leaving, and she began to believe he was sincere in his offer to let her stay as long as she needed. On the 5th day, Martha was hanging laundry on a line behind the cabin when she heard a wagon approaching. Her heart rate quickened. Visitors were rare at the Tucker Ranch, and she couldn't help but fear it might be Thomas. She hurried inside, peering out the window to see an older woman climbing down from a wagon driven by a gray-haired man. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by anxiety. Who were these people, and what would they think of finding her here? The door opened and Matthew came in, followed by the couple. Martha, he said, I'd like you to meet Grace and Harold Wilson. Grace is our local midwife, and Harold's the doctor I mentioned. Martha self-consciously touched her still bruised face. It's nice to meet you. Grace Wilson was a sturdy woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Matthew tells us you've had some trouble, she said, getting straight to the point. Said you were hurt and might need looking at. Martha shot Matthew a betrayed look. I told you I didn't want a doctor. And I told you I'd respect that as long as you were getting better, Matthew countered. But you winced every time you moved yesterday, and I heard you crying in your sleep last night. I'm worried about your ribs. Martha's face flushed at the thought of Matthew hearing her through the walls, but before she could respond, Grace stepped forward. Why don't we have some privacy, dear? She suggested, gesturing toward the bedroom. Let me take a look at those ribs, at least. Martha hesitated, then nodded, following Grace into the bedroom. Once the door was closed, Grace turned to her with a sympathetic expression. I've been the midwife in Sierra City for 30 years, she said as she helped Martha remove the borrowed dress. I've seen what men can do to their wives. No judgment from me, only help if you want it. Martha's eyes filled with tears at the simple kindness in the older woman's voice. Thank you, she whispered. Grace examined her ribs carefully, then the fading bruises on her face and arms. You're healing, she pronounced. Ribs are badly bruised but not broken, from what I can tell. Another week of rest and you'll be much improved. She paused. Matthew says your husband did this because you haven't been able to conceive. Martha nodded, the familiar shame washing over her. And you've been married how long? 6 years. Grace made a thoughtful sound. Have you ever been examined to see if there might be a reason you can't conceive? Martha shook her head. Thomas wouldn't allow it. He said the problem was with me, not him, and that was that. Well, he's wrong about that, Grace said firmly. It takes 2 to make a baby, and the problem could just as easily be with him. She helped Martha back into her dress. If you'd like, I could examine you more thoroughly. Sometimes there are simple solutions. Martha was surprised by the offer. You could do that. I've delivered every baby in Sierra City for 3 decades, Grace said with a smile. I know a thing or two about women's bodies and how they work. But only if you want me to, Martha considered. For years, she had lived with the certainty that there was something wrong with her, something fundamental that made her less of a woman. The possibility of knowing for sure, one way or another, was both terrifying and compelling. Yes, she said finally, I would like that, but not today. Whenever you're ready, Grace assured her. She patted Martha's hand. For now, rest. And let that good man out there take care of you a bit. There aren't many like Matthew Tucker left in this world. When they emerged from the bedroom, Matthew and Dr. Wilson were sitting at the table, deep in conversation. They looked up when the women entered. Everything all right? Matthew asked, his eyes on Martha. She'll be fine, Grace answered for her. Needs rest and good food, which it looks like she's getting plenty of here. She gave Martha's arm a gentle squeeze. I'll come by next week to check on you again. After the Wilsons had gone, Martha turned to Matthew with a mixture of gratitude and exasperation. You promised you wouldn't fetch a doctor. I promised I wouldn't fetch a doctor if you were getting better, Matthew corrected, and I was worried you weren't. Grace was coming this way anyway to deliver a baby at the Jensen farm. I just asked her to stop in. Martha couldn't maintain her irritation in the face of his genuine concern. Thank you, she said softly, for caring enough to worry. Something passed between them then, a moment of connection that made Martha's heart beat faster. Matthew stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. I do care, he said, his voice low. More than I probably should. Before Martha could respond, the moment was broken by Nate bursting through the door. Mr. Tucker, he called, breathless from running. Riders coming, 3 of them. Matthew's expression changed instantly, all warmth vanishing as he moved to the window. Did you recognize them? One looked like Thomas Hannigan, Nate said, shooting a worried glance at Martha. The others I don't know. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. He's found me, she whispered. Matthew turned to her, his face grim but determined. Nate, take Mrs. Hannigan to the root cellar. Stay with her until I come for you. No, Martha protested. I won't hide while you face Thomas and his friends. This is my fight. It's our fight now, Matthew said firmly. And I need to know you're safe so I can handle this properly. He's dangerous when he's angry, so am I, Matthew cut her off. Please, Martha, go with Nate. Something in his expression, not fear, but deadly seriousness, made Martha nod. She allowed Nate to lead her out the back door and across the yard to a small trapdoor set into the ground, which opened to reveal a ladder leading down into a cool, dark space. Mr. Tucker will handle it, Nate assured her as they climbed down, closing the trapdoor behind them. He knows what he's doing. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the trapdoor, Martha could see that the root cellar was well stocked with preserves, potatoes, onions, and apples. Nate found a lantern and lit it, casting a warm glow around the small space. What if there's shooting? Martha whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. Mr. Tucker won't let it come to that if he can help it, Nate said, though he looked nervous. He's good with words, talks men down when they're set on foolishness. They waited in tense silence, straining to hear what was happening above. Martha could make out the sound of horses approaching, men's voices, but not the words. She imagined Thomas dismounting, demanding to know where she was, threatening Matthew as he had threatened so many others who crossed him. Then came the sound she'd been dreading, Thomas's voice, raised in anger, clear enough now to make out the words. I know she's here, Tucker. Her things are gone from our cabin, and half the town saw you riding out with a woman that night." Matthew's response was too low to hear clearly, just a rumble of controlled words. "She's my wife," Thomas shouted back. "I have the right to take her home." This time Matthew's voice rose enough for Martha to catch his reply. "Not when you beat her half to death, you don't." There was a scuffling sound, then the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. "Stay here," Nate whispered urgently to Martha, already moving toward the ladder. "Lock this behind me." Before Martha could protest, he was climbing up and pushing open the trapdoor. She heard him shout, "Mr. Tucker." And then there was chaos shouts, a gunshot, more scuffling. Martha couldn't bear it. Whatever was happening, it was because of her. She climbed the ladder and cautiously pushed open the trapdoor just enough to see. The scene before her made her blood run cold. Thomas stood with his gun drawn, facing Matthew, who had his own revolver pointed steadily at Thomas. Two other men, Martha recognized them as friends of Thomas from the saloon, flanked him, both armed. Nate was on the ground, clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. "You shot the boy," Matthew was saying, his voice deadly calm. "Drop your gun now or the next shot will be the last one you ever hear." "Not until my wife comes with me," Thomas snarled. "She's not going anywhere with you," Matthew replied. "Not today, not ever." Thomas laughed, an ugly sound. "She's my property, Tucker. Law's on my side." "The law doesn't permit a man to beat his wife bloody," Matthew said. "And I was a marshal long enough to know that any judge worth his salt would grant her a divorce on grounds of cruelty." Martha saw Thomas's face twist with rage. "That Barren bitch isn't worth the bullet I'm about to put in you," he spat. Something in Martha snapped. She pushed the trapdoor fully open and climbed out, ignoring Nate's hissed warning. "Thomas," she called, stepping into the open, all eyes turned to her. Thomas's face showed first surprise, then triumph, then fury as he took in her fading bruises, the way she stood tall despite her fear. "Get over here, Martha," he ordered. "We're going home." "No," Martha said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Thomas's face darkened. "You're my wife, I'm a person," Martha interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Not property, not a brood mare. A person who deserves better than fists when I don't give you what you want." "You ungrateful," Thomas raised his gun toward her. But before he could finish his sentence or take aim, Matthew moved with startling speed. There was a blur of motion, the crack of a gunshot, and Thomas was on the ground, clutching his shoulder, his gun fallen from his grasp. His friends, seeing the tide turn, backed away with their hands raised. Matthew kept his gun trained on them as he moved to check on Nate. "You all right, boy?" "Just grazed me," Nate said, though his face was pale with pain. Matthew nodded, then turned his attention back to Thomas's friends. "Take him to town," he ordered. "Get the doctor to look at that shoulder, then tell Sheriff Billings I shot him while defending a woman and my ranch hand from harm. Tell him I'll be in tomorrow to give a full statement." The men hesitated, looking at Thomas, who was cursing through gritted teeth. "Now," Matthew said with quiet authority, "before I decide his shoulder isn't lesson enough." That got them moving. They helped Thomas to his feet and onto his horse, then mounted their own. Thomas, pale with pain and rage, looked at Martha. "This isn't over," he threatened. "Yes, it is," Matthew said before Martha could respond. "She's done with you, and if you come near her again, I won't aim for your shoulder." The men rode off, Thomas slumped in his saddle but still turning to glare back at Martha as they disappeared down the road. As soon as they were out of sight, Martha rushed to Nate's side. "Let me see," she said, gently moving his hand from his arm. The wound was indeed just a graze, but it was bleeding freely. "We need to clean this and bind it." "Inside," Matthew agreed, helping Nate to his feet. Once they were in the cabin, Matthew set his gun aside and helped Martha tend to Nate's wound. "I'm sorry," Martha said as she carefully cleaned the graze with whiskey, making Nate wince. "This is my fault." "No, madam," Nate said firmly. "It's that man's fault for being the kind who'd shoot a boy just standing his ground." Martha's hands trembled as she wrapped a clean bandage around Nate's arm. "He'll be back," she said, the momentary courage she'd felt outside now giving way to dread. "Or he'll be waiting for you in town." "Thomas holds grudges." "Let him," Matthew said calmly. "Sheriff Billings is a good man. Once he hears what happened and sees your bruises, Thomas Hannigan won't find much sympathy in Sierra City. You don't know him like I do, Martha insisted. He's charming when he wants to be. He'll convince people I'm lying, that I ran off with you, that these bruises came from you. Matthew gently took her hands, stilling their nervous movement. Martha, look at me. She raised her eyes to his. I meant what I said out there. This is over. You're done with him. His eyes held hers, steady and certain. I won't let him hurt you again. I won't let him take you anywhere you don't want to go. Do you understand? The intensity in his gaze made Martha's breath catch. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk so much for me? Matthew's hands tightened slightly around hers. Because in the few days you've been here, you've brought more light into this house than it's seen in years. Because you're brave and kind and strong, even after everything you've endured. He paused, then added more softly, because when I look at you, I see someone worth fighting for. Martha felt tears well up in her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of fear or pain. They were something else entirely, hope, perhaps, or the first fragile beginnings of joy. Thank you, she whispered, not trusting herself to say more. That night, after Nate had gone to the bunkhouse with strict instructions to rest his arm, Martha and Matthew sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Despite the day's violence, or perhaps because they had faced it and survived, Martha felt a curious peace. What happens now? She asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Matthew leaned back in his chair, considering. Tomorrow I'll ride into town, speak with Sheriff Billings. We'll need to talk about filing for divorce on grounds of cruelty. Divorce, Martha repeated the word as if testing it. The idea had seemed impossible just days ago, but now. Unless you don't want that, Matthew added quickly. No, I do, Martha assured him. It's just it feels so final. And frightening in its way. A new beginning, Matthew suggested, not an ending, Martha nodded slowly. A new beginning, she echoed, liking the sound of it. They were quiet again, the night air cool around them, the distant howl of a coyote the only sound besides the creaking of their rocking chairs. You could stay here, Matthew said after a while, after the divorce, as long as you want. Martha glanced at him. His face was partly in shadow, but she could see the sincerity in his expression. As what? She asked softly. Your housekeeper. Matthew turned to face her fully. As whatever you want to be, Martha. I won't pretend I haven't come to care for you more than I should, given your situation. But I also won't pressure you. You've had enough of men making decisions for you. Martha's heart beat faster at his admission. In less than a week, this man had shown her more kindness, more respect than Thomas had in 6 years of marriage. I care for you too, she confessed. But I'm still married, and even after a divorce, I don't know if I'll ever be able to give a man what he truly wants from a wife. And what is it you think I want? Matthew asked gently. Martha looked away. Children, a family, the one thing I can't seem to provide. Matthew was quiet for so long that Martha feared she'd offended him. Then he reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. Martha, he said, his voice low and earnest, a family is more than children. It's people who love and support each other, who face life's challenges together. He squeezed her hand. And if it matters to you, my sister tried for years to have children before she and her husband found happiness with their adopted daughter. There are many ways to build a family. Martha felt a lump in her throat. Thomas always said Thomas was wrong, Matthew interrupted firmly. About you, about what makes a woman valuable, about everything that matters. Martha looked at their joined hands, then up at Matthew's face, finding only sincerity there. I think, she said carefully, that I would like to stay, for a while at least, until I know better who I am without Thomas. Matthew nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. Then that's what we'll do, one day at a time. The next morning, Martha woke to find Matthew already gone, a note on the table saying he'd ridden into town to speak with Sheriff Billings and would be back by afternoon. Nate was resting in the bunkhouse on Martha's insistence, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She busied herself with baking bread and churning butter, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms. As she worked, she thought about Matthew's words from the night before about family being more than children, about the possibility of a new beginning. For so long, her worth had been tied to her ability to conceive, and her failure had become the core of her identity. The idea that she might be valued for other reasons, that she might build a life defined by something other than that failure, was both liberating and terrifying. By midday, Martha had worked herself into a state of nervous anticipation, wondering what news Matthew would bring from town. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching, she hurried to the door, only to freeze at the sight before her. Matthew was riding in, but he wasn't alone. Behind him in a small wagon sat Grace Wilson, the midwife. Martha stepped onto the porch, confused. "What's happening?" she called as Matthew dismounted. "I hope you don't mind," he said, coming up the steps. "Grace mentioned yesterday that she'd offered to examine you, and I thought maybe knowing for certain about your ability to have children might help you make decisions about your future." He looked suddenly uncertain. "If I've overstepped, no," Martha interrupted, touched by his thoughtfulness. "No, you haven't. I do want to know. I'm just surprised." Grace approached, carrying her medical bag. "I brought everything I need," she said briskly. "And I've delivered enough babies in makeshift conditions to manage an examination here." She smiled kindly at Martha. "Only if you're ready, dear." Martha took a deep breath. "I'm ready." The examination was thorough but gentle, Grace explaining each step as she went. Afterward, Martha dressed and joined Grace and Matthew at the kitchen table, where Grace had insisted they all sit together for her findings. "There's nothing physically wrong with you that I can detect," Grace said straightforwardly. "Your womb appears healthy, and from what you've told me about your monthly courses, everything is functioning as it should." Martha frowned. "But then why? It could be any number of reasons," Grace continued. "Sometimes these things are mysterious, sometimes they're simple." She glanced at Matthew, then back at Martha. "It could be that your husband is the one with the problem, or it could be that the stress and fear you've lived with these past years has made your body inhospitable to conception. The mind and body are connected in ways we're only beginning to understand." "So you're saying I might be able to have children?" Martha asked, hardly daring to hope. "I'm saying there's no physical reason why you couldn't," Grace clarified. "Whether you will or not, only time will tell. But I've seen women conceive after years of trying, once they were in happier circumstances." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. For so long, she'd carried the certainty of her failure, the belief that she was somehow broken. To hear that she might not be, that the problem might lie elsewhere, or might be overcome, was overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered to Grace. The older woman patted her hand. "You deserve to know the truth, child, and you deserve a chance at happiness, whatever form that takes." After Grace had gone, Martha found Matthew on the porch, giving her the privacy he thought she might need. "Thank you," she said, sitting beside him, "for arranging that." Matthew nodded. "I thought it might help knowing one way or the other." He hesitated. "If it's not too personal, may I ask what she found?" Martha told him what Grace had said, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "So you see, I might be able to have children someday, or I might not. There's no certainty." Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Life rarely gives us certainty, Martha. All we can do is make the best choices with what we know at the time." "And what do you think I should choose?" Martha asked softly. Matthew looked at her, his eyes serious. "I think you should choose what brings you peace. What makes you feel whole and valued, whether that includes children or not." He paused. "And I think you should know that I meant what I said last night. A woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to bear children." Martha felt something shift inside her at his words, some long-held tension finally releasing. "In town today," she said, changing the subject slightly. "Did you see Thomas?" Matthew's expression darkened. "I did. His arm was in a sling, and he was telling anyone who'd listen how I shot him without provocation." His mouth quirked in a grim smile. Unfortunately for him, Sheriff Billings had already heard from Nate, who rode in at dawn despite my orders to rest. Between Nate's testimony and the fact that half the town has suspected Thomas of beating you for years, Billings isn't inclined to press charges against me." "And what about the divorce?" Martha asked, her throat dry. "Billings says you have a strong case." "He's writing to the circuit judge now, who will be in Sierra City next month." Matthew reached for her hand. "In the meantime, he's warned Thomas to stay away from you and this ranch on pain of imprisonment." Will he listen? He will if he's smart, Matthew said. And if he's not, well, I meant what I said yesterday too. I won't let him hurt you again. Martha squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. I believe you. As the days passed, Martha settled into life at the Tucker Ranch as if she had always been there. She cooked and cleaned, mended and gardened, while Matthew and Nate, once his arm had healed enough, tended the cattle. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch or by the fire, talking or sometimes just enjoying the peaceful silence. Martha found herself laughing more, sleeping better, the constant fear that had been her companion for years gradually fading. And she found herself watching Matthew when he didn't notice the way he moved with quiet confidence, the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the horses, the rare but transformative smile that lit his face when something pleased him. A month after she had arrived at the ranch, bruised and terrified, Martha realized she was falling in love with Matthew Tucker. The realization didn't come as a shock, but rather as the acknowledgement of something she'd known for some time. What did surprise her was the absence of fear that accompanied the feeling, no dread of disappointing him, no anxiety about failing to meet his expectations. Just a warm certainty that what was growing between them was something good and true. The circuit judge arrived in Sierra City on a Tuesday. Matthew drove Martha into town in his wagon, Nate riding alongside as additional protection, though Thomas had kept his distance since the shooting. The courthouse was packed with curious townspeople, many of whom Martha recognized but hadn't spoken to in years, Thomas having gradually isolated her from friends and community. Thomas was there too, his arm still in a sling, his face set in a mask of injured dignity. He avoided looking directly at Martha, but she could feel his anger like a physical presence in the room. The judge, a stern-faced man named Hollister, listened first to Martha's account of her marriage, then to Grace Wilson's testimony about the extent of Martha's injuries when she'd examined her. Several townspeople came forward to testify that they had suspected abuse for years. Even the bartender from the saloon testified that Thomas often boasted about keeping his woman in line when he was in his cups. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he painted a picture of a loving husband betrayed by an unfaithful wife who had run off with another man at the first opportunity. He claimed Martha's injuries were the result of a fall, not his fists, and that Matthew had shot him when he merely tried to reclaim his lawful wife. Judge Hollister listened impassively to all testimony, his expression giving no hint of his thoughts. When both sides had finished, he called a recess to consider his judgment. Martha waited anxiously in a small anteroom, Matthew and Nate standing guard outside to ensure Thomas couldn't approach her. When the bailiff called them back in, she was trembling, terrified that the judge would side with Thomas, would order her to return to a life of fear and pain. Matthew must have sensed her fear, for he took her hand as they walked back into the courtroom, a public declaration of support that caused a ripple of whispers among the spectators. Judge Hollister cleared his throat as they all stood before him. I've heard the testimony presented today, and I find that there is ample evidence of cruel treatment by the husband toward the wife in this marriage. He looked directly at Thomas. Mr. Hannigan, the law may give a husband certain rights over his wife, but those rights have never included the right to physical abuse. Your actions have forfeited any claim you might have had on this woman. Martha felt a wave of relief so powerful she might have fallen if not for Matthew's steady presence beside her. I hereby grant the dissolution of marriage between Thomas and Martha Hannigan on grounds of cruelty, the judge continued. Mrs. Hannigan, you are no longer legally bound to this man. You are free to determine your own future. There was a moment of stunned silence, then a murmur of approval from many in the crowd. Thomas's face contorted with rage. This is an outrage, he shouted. She's my wife, not anymore, Judge Hollister said firmly. And I suggest you accept this ruling with whatever dignity you can muster, Mr. Hannigan, before I find you in contempt of my court. Thomas glared at Martha, then at Matthew, his eyes promising retribution. But with the sheriff and judge watching, he could do nothing but storm out of the courtroom, his friends trailing behind him. Martha stood in shock, hardly able to believe it was over. Free, she was free. Congratulations, Mrs. Judge Hollister paused. I suppose it's Miss Hollister now, unless you prefer to keep your married name. Hollister, Martha said quickly. Martha Hollister. She wanted nothing of Thomas to follow her into her new life. Outside the courthouse, well-wishers surrounded Martha, many of them women who whispered words of admiration for her courage. It was overwhelming after so long in isolation, but also healing to realize that not everyone had believed Thomas's lies about her. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Martha lost in thoughts of her newfound freedom, Matthew respectfully giving her space to process the day's events. Only when they arrived home, and Martha was startled to realize she did think of the Tucker Ranch as home now, did Matthew speak. What will you do now? He asked as they sat on the porch with coffee, Nate having tactfully made himself scarce. Martha looked out over the land that had become her sanctuary. I don't know, she admitted. For so long I couldn't think beyond survival. Freedom feels strange. Wonderful, but strange. Matthew nodded in understanding. You're welcome to stay here as long as you like. No expectations, no pressure. Martha turned to look at him, this man who had risked so much for a woman he barely knew, who had never once made her feel like a failure or a burden. What if I want there to be expectations? She asked softly. Matthew's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? Martha took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I mean that I care for you, Matthew, more than I thought I could care for anyone again. And I hope that you might feel the same way. Matthew set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. I do, he said simply. I have almost from the moment I found you hiding behind that water trough in town. Martha felt a smile spread across her face, unrestrained and genuine. Even knowing I might never give you children, Matthew reached for her hand. Martha, when I look at you, I don't see what you can't give me. I see who you are, brave, kind, strong. I see the woman who brought life back into this house, who faces each day with courage despite everything she's endured. His eyes held hers, earnest and true. If God blesses us with children someday, I'll be grateful, but you've already filled my heart in ways I never imagined possible. Tears filled Martha's eyes at his words so different from anything Thomas had ever said to her, words that valued her for herself, not for what her body could or couldn't do. I love you, Matthew Tucker, she whispered, the declaration both terrifying and exhilarating. Matthew's face lit with that rare, transformative smile. And I love you, Martha Hollister. He lifted her hand to his lips. Not too soon, I hope, Martha shook her head. No, just right. In the days that followed, Martha and Matthew settled into a new understanding, their relationship deepening with each shared moment. They agreed to take things slowly. Martha was newly divorced, still healing from years of abuse, and they both wanted to build something that would last. News of Thomas leaving Sierra City reached them through Grace Wilson, who visited the ranch regularly, both as a friend and to check on Martha's health. Apparently, Thomas had sold his claim and headed for Nevada, unable to face the town that had sided with his wife over him. Good riddance, Grace had said firmly. That man was poison. With the threat of Thomas receding, Martha felt herself unfurling like a flower long kept in the dark. She began to remember the woman she had been before her marriage, curious, hopeful, full of laughter, and discovered that woman wasn't entirely gone, just deeply buried. Matthew watched this transformation with obvious joy, never pushing, always supportive. They spent evenings talking about everything and nothing, his dreams for the ranch, her love of books, their shared hope for the future. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, Matthew carving wood or cleaning his tack while Martha sewed or knitted. 3 months after the divorce, on a crisp autumn evening with the mountains painted gold and red by the setting sun, Matthew asked Martha to marry him. They were riding together, checking the far boundaries of the ranch when he stopped his horse beside a small stream. I'd like to build a house here, he said, gesturing to the clearing. The old cabin is fine for now, but I've always thought this would be the perfect spot for a proper home. Martha looked around, seeing the beauty of the location sheltered from the worst of the weather by a stand of pines, with the stream providing water and the mountains rising majestically in the background. It's lovely, she agreed. Why haven't you built here before?" Matthew dismounted and helped her down from her horse. "Didn't see the point of building a home just for myself," he said, taking her hands in his. "A house needs a family to make it a home." Martha's heart began to race as she realized where this was leading. "Martha," Matthew said, his voice steady but his eyes revealing his nerves, "these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my days showing you that love." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me, make a home with me here?" Martha felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds as he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache with happiness. They were married a month later in the small church in Sierra City, Grace Wilson beaming from the front pew, Nate standing proudly as Matthew's best man. Martha wore a simple dress of ivory silk that Grace had helped her make, and Matthew looked so handsome in his Sunday suit that she could hardly believe he was really hers. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, both of them having lived enough to know that what mattered wasn't the wedding but the marriage that would follow. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Martha felt no fear, only a profound sense of rightness, of having found her true home at last. Their wedding night was a revelation for Martha. With Thomas, intimacy had always been a duty, often painful, always focused on conception rather than connection. With Matthew, it was a communion of bodies and souls, tender and passionate by turns. He was patient with her hesitation, gentle with her inexperience in pleasure, and by morning, Martha understood for the first time why the Bible spoke of knowing one's spouse in both body and spirit. The months that followed were a time of profound happiness for Martha. True to his word, Matthew began construction on their new home, with Martha offering input on every aspect of the design. They planned for a big kitchen, a library for Martha's growing collection of books, and yes, a nursery not with expectation but with hope. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm. Martha continued to care for the house and cook for the men, but now she also rode out with Matthew sometimes, learning the ranching business, her confidence growing with each new skill mastered. In the evenings, they would often read aloud to each other by the fire, Matthew's deep voice bringing stories to life in a way Martha had never experienced. Spring came to the mountains, bringing new calves, wildflowers, and the completion of their new home. As they moved their belongings from the old cabin to the new house, Martha felt a sense of completion, the circle of her life turning from despair to joy, from fear to love. It was in their new home, on a warm June evening almost a year after she had fled from Thomas, that Martha realized she was pregnant. She had been feeling unusual for weeks, tired, queasy in the mornings, certain foods suddenly unappealing, but had attributed it to the stress of the move and the extra work of setting up the new house. It wasn't until she noticed that her monthly courses were late, very late, that she allowed herself to consider the possibility. She waited another week to be certain before telling Matthew. When she finally did, on a Sunday morning as they lingered in bed, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and most of all, reassurance. "Martha, this is wonderful news," he said, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. "But I want you to know, child or no child, you are enough. You have always been enough." Martha kissed him, her heart full to bursting. "I know," she whispered. "That's how I know this child will be born of love, not obligation." The pregnancy progressed without complications, though Martha was careful not to take anything for granted. Grace visited regularly, monitoring both mother and child with professional care and grandmotherly excitement. "Everything is exactly as it should be," she assured Martha at each visit. "You're healthy, the baby is growing well, and that husband of yours is hovering just the right amount, concerned but not smothering." Martha laughed at that. Matthew had indeed been attentive without being overbearing, making sure she rested when needed but not treating her as if she were made of glass. As her body changed, growing round with new life, Martha marveled at the miracle of it. After so many years of believing herself barren, each flutter of movement, Each expansion of her waist felt like a gift beyond price. But even more precious was the knowledge that she was loved for herself, not for the child she carried that Matthew had chosen her, had filled his heart with her, long before there was any hope of a baby. On a snowy December morning, after a labor that Grace declared textbook perfect, Martha gave birth to a son. He had Matthew's dark hair and Martha's blue eyes, and when they placed him in Matthew's arms, the look of wonder on his face made Martha weep with joy. "What shall we call him?" Matthew asked, his voice hushed with awe. Martha had been thinking about names for months, weighing options, considering family traditions. But in that moment, looking at her husband holding their son, she knew. "James," she said. "After your father." Matthew's eyes filled with tears. "James," he repeated, trying out the name. "James Tucker, it's perfect." He leaned down to kiss Martha's forehead. "You're perfect, both of you." In the years that followed, the Tucker family thrived. James grew into a sturdy, curious toddler with his father's quiet confidence and his mother's love of books. The ranch prospered under Matthew's careful management, expanding to include more cattle and a small but respected horse breeding program. 2 years after James's birth, Martha gave birth to twin girls, Sarah and Elizabeth, completing their family in a way that sometimes seemed miraculous to Martha, given how certain she had once been that she would never know the joy of motherhood. Nate stayed on at the ranch, eventually becoming Matthew's partner in the business and building a small house of his own on the property. He married a sweet-natured girl from town, and their children became friends and playmates for the Tucker children. On the 5th anniversary of the day Matthew had found Martha hiding behind the water trough, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. "Did you ever imagine this?" Martha asked, leaning her head against Matthew's shoulder. "That night when you found me, did you ever think we would end up here?" Matthew's arm tightened around her. "I hoped," he admitted. "From the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you. As if my heart knew yours before we'd even spoken." Martha smiled, turning to look at his beloved face, lined now with a few more creases but still as handsome to her as ever. "I was so broken then," she mused, "so convinced I was worthless because I couldn't give Thomas children." "You were never worthless," Matthew said firmly, "children or no children." "I know that now," Martha said, her eyes moving to James, who was showing his little sisters how to build a fort from sticks. "You taught me that. You filled my heart first before I ever filled my womb." Matthew kissed her then, a kiss full of the love and respect that had healed Martha's wounded spirit and allowed her body to heal as well. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I thank God every day for guiding me to you," he whispered. "For the chance to love you, to be loved by you. For our children, yes, but first and always for you, Martha." Martha's eyes filled with happy tears as she looked at the life they had built together, the home, the family, the love that had grown from the ashes of her first marriage into something strong and true and enduring. "And I thank God for you, Matthew Tucker," she said softly. "For seeing value in me when I couldn't see it in myself, for loving me whole again." As the children's laughter floated to them on the evening breeze and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Martha knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety or security, but true happiness, the kind that comes from being loved completely, unconditionally, for exactly who you are. In the end, it wasn't the children who had healed Martha's broken spirit or given her life meaning, though she treasured each of them beyond measure. It was the love of a good man who had seen her worth when she was at her lowest, who had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, who had filled his heart with her long before she had filled her womb with his child. And in that love, Martha had found not just healing but redemption, the chance to become who she was always meant to be, to live the life she was always meant to live, surrounded by the family she had once despaired of ever having, in the home she had helped to build with her own 2 hands and her own brave heart.